There are places in the world where people disappear, and what remains is not evidence, not closure, not even a clear sequence of events, but something far more unsettling. A silence that refuses to explain itself no matter how much time passes or how many people try to understand it. Across different regions of Africa, there are cases that never reached headlines outside their borders. Stories that were whispered locally and then slowly dissolved into uncertainty, where individuals vanished without a trace in environments that seemed, at least on the surface, ordinary and controlled, leaving behind families, investigators, and entire communities struggling not with what happened, but with the fact that nothing concrete ever surfaced at all. In many of these disappearances, there is no sign of struggle, no confirmed witness, and no physical evidence that clearly points in any direction, which forces investigators into a frustrating position where every possibility remains open, and every theory feels equally fragile, creating a landscape where truth becomes almost impossible to isolate from speculation. What makes these cases even more disturbing is not just the absence of answers, but the presence of patterns that are difficult to ignore. Because when you begin to examine them closely, you start to notice recurring elements, moments where something small seems overlooked, or where human decisions, timing, and circumstance align in ways that feel too precise to be random, yet never precise enough to prove intention. Some disappearances happen in remote regions, where geography itself becomes an obstacle. Vast terrains, where a person can vanish simply by moving in the wrong direction at the wrong time, while others occur in populated areas, where the expectation of witnesses and surveillance only deepens the mystery when neither produces anything useful. There are cases involving travelers who never reached their destinations, individuals who stepped out briefly and were never seen again, and even situations where people vanished from spaces that were considered secure, which challenges the basic assumption that proximity to others guarantees safety or at least visibility. In each story, the initial moments often appear ordinary, almost forgettable, which is precisely what makes them so difficult to reconstruct later. Because the point at which something goes wrong is rarely obvious in real time. And by the time the absence is noticed, whatever happened has already slipped beyond immediate reach. As we move through these cases, what becomes increasingly clear is that the mystery is not just about where these people went, but about how entire sequences of events can unfold without leaving behind the kind of traces we rely on to make sense of reality, forcing us to confront a possibility that is both simple and deeply uncomfortable, that sometimes people can disappear in ways that systems, logic, and investigation are not fully equipped to resolve. And in a place as vast, diverse, and complex as Africa, where environments, cultures, and infrastructures vary dramatically from one region to another, these disappearances take on different forms, but often lead to the same outcome, a complete absence of resolution. The cases you are about to hear are not just unsolved, they are unresolved in a way that resists closure itself. And as each one unfolds, the question will not only be what happened, but whether it is even possible to know. In 2013, an experienced British explorer named Benedict Allen set out on a journey across a remote region in northern Africa. Driven by his long-standing interest in documenting isolated communities and landscapes that remained largely untouched by modern infrastructure, and given his history of navigating difficult environments, there was little reason for concern when his expedition began. He was not inexperienced, nor was he careless. As he had shared his planned route with close contacts, outlined expected check-in points, and carried the necessary equipment to sustain himself in unpredictable terrain, which is precisely what made the early signs of his disappearance so difficult to interpret, because nothing about his preparation suggested vulnerability. At first, Communication did not stop suddenly, but instead became irregular, as if something was gradually interfering with his ability to maintain contact, creating a situation where there was no clear moment that signaled danger, only a growing absence that slowly became impossible to ignore. When concern escalated and authorities were notified, search efforts began under conditions that immediately complicated any form of tracking. As the region's vast and unforgiving landscape offered little in terms of recoverable traces, and natural elements such as wind and shifting terrain could erase signs of movement within a very short period of time. Investigators faced an unusual challenge, not because there were too many leads, but because there were almost none, with no abandoned gear, no confirmed sightings, and no direct evidence pointing toward an accident, an encounter, or a deliberate act, forcing every possible explanation to remain open without the ability to confirm or eliminate any of them. Some theories suggested that he may have deviated from his intended path, either out of curiosity or necessity, while others considered the possibility of an unexpected encounter with local groups. But in the absence of witnesses or physical proof, these scenarios remain speculative, unable to form a coherent narrative of what actually took place. As days passed and turned into weeks, the nature of the search shifted, moving away from immediate recovery toward an attempt to reconstruct a sequence of events that had left almost no tangible footprint, which is one of the most difficult positions for any investigation to operate within. What makes this case particularly unsettling is how quickly it transitioned from a controlled expedition into a complete disappearance, highlighting how even individuals who understand risk and prepare for it can still be overtaken by circumstances that leave no visible trace behind. In regions where geography limits oversight and communication is inconsistent, the difference between being present and being completely untraceable can depend on a single moment, one decision, or one unforeseen event, after which the opportunity to understand what happened begins to disappear as well. And as this case begins to fade into uncertainty, it introduces a pattern that will continue to emerge, where the lack of evidence is not just an obstacle, but the defining characteristic of the disappearance itself. In 1985, a young German traveler named Stephanie Kay arrived in East Africa with the intention of exploring regions that had become increasingly popular among backpackers seeking a sense of distance from structured tourism, and like many others before her, she followed routes that were considered accessible, frequently used, and relatively safe by local standards. She moved between towns using public transportation, stayed in modest accommodations, and maintained occasional contact with family, which allowed her journey to unfold in a way that appeared ordinary, predictable, and well, within the expectations of someone traveling independently through the region. At a certain point, she informed those close to her that she would be heading toward a more remote area, known for its natural landscapes. A place that attracted visitors but also required longer periods without reliable communication, which initially did not raise immediate concern, as temporary silence was a normal part of that kind of travel. However, what began as expected distance slowly turned into something else, as days passed without any updates, and attempts to reach her failed without explanation, creating a growing sense of unease that eventually led to formal reports being filed and local authorities becoming involved. When investigators attempted to retrace her movements, they were able to confirm parts of her journey, including locations where she had stayed and individuals who briefly interacted with her. But beyond a certain point, the trail became fragmented, with no clear indication of where she went or who she may have encountered next. Unlike cases where there is a defined last sighting, this disappearance seemed to dissolve gradually, as if each step she took moved her further into a space where documentation and observation became increasingly limited. until there was no longer any reliable way to follow her path. Some accounts suggested that she may have accepted transportation from individuals outside the usual tourist routes, while others considered the possibility of an accident in an isolated area. But once again, the absence of physical evidence prevented any of these possibilities from becoming more than speculation. What stands out in this case is not a single suspicious moment, but the accumulation of small gaps, missing confirmations, unverified movements, and delayed reactions, all of which contributed to a situation where the disappearance was only recognized after the opportunity to intervene had already passed. As the investigation extended over time, it encountered the same limitations seen in other cases across the region, where infrastructure, record-keeping, and communication systems were not designed to track individual movement with precision, especially in areas where travel relied heavily on informal networks. Eventually, the case reached a point where there were no new leads to pursue, no evidence to re-examine, and no clear direction for further investigation, leaving behind a narrative defined not by what was discovered, but by what was never confirmed. And as this pattern repeats, it becomes increasingly clear that these disappearances are not always marked by dramatic events, but often by quiet transitions, where ordinary decisions gradually lead into circumstances that remove all visibility, until the person is no longer traceable at all. In 1999, a regional aid worker named Daniel M., who had been operating between multiple countries in Central Africa, was assigned to coordinate logistics for supply distribution in an area affected by ongoing instability. And unlike travelers or explorers, his presence in the region was structured, documented, and tied to an organization that maintained regular communication protocols. He followed a routine that involved moving between known checkpoints, reporting his location at scheduled intervals, and working alongside both local teams and international staff, which created a framework where his movements were expected to be visible and traceable at nearly all times. On the day he disappeared, nothing initially appeared out of place, as he departed from a known location with a clear destination, traveling a route that had been used repeatedly without major incident. And for the first part of the journey, there was no indication of disruption or deviation. At some point along this route, however, communication stopped entirely. Not in a gradual way like in previous cases, but with a complete and immediate absence, as if the sequence of events had been interrupted without warning, leaving behind a precise, last known position but no explanation for what followed. When his absence was noticed and reported, a coordinated response was initiated more quickly than in many other cases, involving both local authorities and organizational resources. Yet, even with this structured approach, the investigation encountered the same fundamental problem: the lack of verifiable evidence beyond the last, confirmed point of contact. The vehicle he was traveling in was never located. No debris was found along the expected route, and no witnesses came forward with credible accounts, which created a situation where even the basic question of whether he had reached a certain point could not be definitively answered. Given the regional context, several possibilities were considered, including the risk of encountering armed groups, unauthorized checkpoints, or opportunistic threats along less monitored sections of the. But without physical evidence, none of these scenarios could be confirmed or prioritized. What makes this case particularly difficult to process is the contrast between the structured nature of his work and the complete absence of information following his disappearance. As systems that are designed to maintain visibility suddenly failed to provide any clarity at all. Even aerial searches and extended ground efforts did not produce results, reinforcing the idea that whatever occurred did so in a way that either left no trace or placed any evidence beyond the reach of recovery, which is a recurring theme in environments where both geography and instability limit investigative reach. Over time, the case shifted from an active search to an unresolved file, not because it lacked importance, but because it lacked direction, leaving those involved with a fixed point in time where everything stopped, and nothing beyond that point could be reconstructed with certainty. And as these cases accumulate, they begin to form a pattern where disappearance is not defined by what is found, but by what remains permanently absent, suggesting that in certain conditions, even structured systems are not enough to prevent someone from vanishing completely. In 2008, a small group of local fishermen operating along the western coast of Africa reported something that initially seemed routine: the sighting of an abandoned boat drifting without direction, partially intact, with no visible damage that would immediately suggest an accident, and yet with no one on board, no movement, and no clear indication of what had happened to those who were last known to be using it. The vessel was later identified as belonging to a man named Ibrahim S., who had departed days earlier on what was expected to be a short and familiar journey along a route he had traveled many times before, navigating coastal waters that, while not entirely without risk, were well within his experience and understanding. When the boat was recovered and examined, what investigators found only deepened the mystery, because there were no signs of struggle, no evidence of mechanical failure, and no indication that the vessel had encountered severe weather conditions, which would normally leave some form of visible impact. Personal belongings were still on board, tools remained in place, and nothing appeared to have been taken or disturbed in a way that suggested external interference, creating a scenario where the absence of the individual stood in stark contrast to the normal state of everything around him. Attempts to reconstruct the timeline focused on the last confirmed sighting, which placed him moving steadily along his intended path, without deviation or reported concern, and yet somewhere between that moment and the discovery of the boat, something occurred that removed him entirely from the environment without leaving behind a clear trace. Search efforts extended into surrounding waters and nearby coastal areas, but as time passed, the likelihood of recovery diminished, not only because of the natural challenges of the ocean, but because there was no defined point of incident, no location where resources could be concentrated with confidence. Some theories suggested the possibility of an accidental fall overboard, a momentary lapse that could have gone unnoticed and unrecorded, while others considered more deliberate scenarios, including the chance of encountering another vessel or individuals who were never identified. But once again, the lack of evidence prevented any of these explanations from being confirmed. What makes this case particularly significant is how it reflects a different type of disappearance, one that does not rely on vast land or remote isolation, but instead unfolds in an open environment where visibility should, in theory, increase the chances of understanding what happened, yet in practice offers no additional clarity. The ocean, much like remote terrain, has the ability to absorb events without preserving them, erasing sequences of action and leaving behind only fragments that cannot be assembled into a complete narrative, which forces investigators to rely on assumptions rather than conclusions. As with the other cases, the story does not end with resolution, but with an absence that remains fixed over time, reinforcing the idea that disappearance is not always about complexity, but sometimes about how easily a sequence can break without leaving anything behind to explain it. As these cases come together, not as isolated events, but as fragments of a larger pattern, what begins to emerge is not a single explanation, but a shared structure of absence, where each disappearance follows a different path, yet arrives at the same destination. A complete lack of resolution that resists reconstruction no matter how much time or effort is applied. There are no definitive answers connecting these stories. No confirmed mechanism that explains how individuals can vanish so completely across such different environments. And yet the similarities remain difficult to ignore, because in each case, there is a moment where visibility ends, where information stops, and where everything that follows becomes inaccessible. It would be easy to assume that these disappearances are the result of extreme circumstances, rare events that exist outside the boundaries of normal experience. But what makes them unsettling is precisely the opposite, the fact that they begin within ordinary contexts. Familiar routines, planned routes, and controlled movements that give no immediate indication of what is about to unfold. In each situation, there is a point where something small shifts, a decision, an encounter, a change in direction, or even a moment of inattention. And while that moment may seem insignificant in isolation, it becomes the dividing line between presence and complete absence, after which no reliable sequence can be established. The systems that are meant to provide structure, communication, tracking, and response all function up to a certain threshold, but beyond that point, they reveal their limitations, especially in environments where geography, infrastructure, and unpredictability intersect in ways that cannot be fully controlled or monitored. What remains, then, is not just the mystery of what happened to each individual, but a broader question about how many similar cases exist without documentation, without investigation, and without recognition, existing only as silent gaps in places where disappearance can occur without interruption. And perhaps the most unsettling aspect is not the idea that these events are rare, but the possibility that they are not, that they happen more often than we realize, simply without the visibility required to bring them into focus. Because in the end, the question is no longer just where these people went, but whether, in certain conditions, it is even possible to know what happened at all, or if some disappearances are destined to remain exactly as they began, without trace, without explanation, and without closure.